But at this point, I am delighted to introduce to you Nathalie Theberge, who has made time for us in an incredibly busy schedule as she is hosting right now people from UNESCO. Nathalie Theberge, the Director General of Copyright and International Trade Policy at Canadian Heritage since 2014, joined the Federal Public Service in 1996 as a communications advisor to the Privy Council Office. Nathalie has been directly involved with the Convention on the protection and promotion of the diversity of cultural expressions since its negotiation in the early 2000s. In 2004, she was appointed Director of the International Network on Cultural Policy, a network of over 60 national ministers of culture responsible for producing the first draft text of the Convention. As the Director General, she leads work on domestic and international copyright policy issues, bilateral and multilateral trade negotiations, cultural exports development, and is the Canadian national point of contact for the 2005 Convention. Please join me in welcoming Nathalie Theberge.
So, can everybody hear me fine? Yes? Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much, and thank you to Professor Findlay for giving me the opportunity to make this presentation. This is my first WebEx experience, so please bear with me. I can see you in a little corner of my screen, so I'll try to do this well. So thank you, of course, to the University of Saskatchewan and to my friend Charles Vallerand, Professor Findlay, for organizing this. I've known Charles for many years, and I listened to his presentation carefully in hope that he wouldn't steal my thunder, which he did a bit, but that's okay. I'm used to it, Charles. And so, évidemment, nos invités qui veulent s'adresser à moi en français, vous êtes évidemment le bienvenu, so I can please feel free to ask your questions in the language of your choice, not my choice, your choice, and I'll do my best. I was a little puzzled when I started to think about the type of presentation I would want to do for you today, this morning. The actual header in the program says that I'm going to talk about the UNESCO Convention, but I don't think I will, actually. I think I want to use the UNESCO Convention as an opportunity, perhaps, to have a more focused conversation on one particular aspect of the convention, which is the promotion aspect. Charles did speak a lot about the origins of this convention, which were largely rooted in a desire to protect cultural diversity broadly, but specifically also for Canadian purposes. You will all remember the infamous magazines war, which sort of triggered this idea that the international legal framework, meaning the WTA, the World Trade Organization, was not well adapted to the particular characteristics of culture. And so this is not necessarily what I want to discuss with you today briefly, and I'll try to keep my presentation short. I want to bring focus to something else, which is more of the promotion side of things. I heard Professor Findlay say Canada's back, and I completely agree. And I think Canada being back is also because there's a recognition that with the move to digital, there's an opportunity to do more of that promotion of Canadian cultural content. And by doing so, you promote a more diversified world cultural offer. So that's the link that I would make to the UNESCO Convention without spending much time on that particular instrument. So the first slide is just a recap, and most of you, of course, are experts in cultural policy. You're very familiar with what the current toolbox looks like, so at the federal level, and it mirrors to some extent what you would find at the PT level, at the provincial level. But I thought it was interesting, perhaps for further reference for all of you, to have this slide, which is a reminder that the way that the federal government actually supports cultural diversity and culture more broadly in Canada is multidimensional, and it's complementary to what you will find in terms of policies and programs delivered at the PT level. So the way the slide is structured, you've got, of course, the legislation, and I'm not going to go through all the elements because I want to move very quickly to the actual core of my presentation. But you've got, of course, the legislation, the financial support, and Charles spoke about Canada Music Fund, etc. There's a whole array of policies and programs. You also have, of course, like I said, national policies around foreign investment, AV treaty, and you've got the national institutions who play certainly a key role: CBC, Radio-Canada, Council for the Arts, and my hat to Simon Brault for completely rethinking the way the Canadian Council for the Arts is going to be operating from now on. I think what Simon is doing is absolutely wonderful. And Téléfilm, and of course the NFB. This is just a snapshot, a reminder of what the toolbox for the support of domestic culture looks like. In terms of what the federal government has been doing for culture, but at the international level, Charles mentioned the UNESCO Convention, 2005 Convention. We were certainly at the origin of the idea behind this UNESCO Convention. We were at the forefront of the negotiations of this convention, and we were the first country to ratify the UNESCO Convention. And like Charles said, we remain an active player. I'm very proud to be the national point of contact for this convention, and we work very closely with the provinces and with civil society, with Charles and others, to make sure that this convention continues to grow, because, of course, over the last 10 years, new challenges and new opportunities have emerged. And so certainly one of our key concern or key priority for the Canadian government as we participate to the governance of this UNESCO Convention is to make sure that it remains relevant and that discussions take place within the realm of this convention around issues of interest, digital being one of them, but there are others that come up. I heard also Charles talk about what we do in terms of trade, because while the UNESCO Convention does give us some point of reference from an international legal point of view, we still have to make sure that as a federal government, as we engage in free trade negotiations, that we preserve what needs to be preserved to be able, as a society, to develop and maintain cultural policies. And we've done this from the very first free trade agreement that we signed with the U.S. We did it in NAFTA, and we did it very recently in the context of the Canada-European Union Free Trade Agreement and the free trade agreement with Korea. With respect to Trans-Pacific Partnership, we can talk about it, but it's still not a deal. It's still just a negotiated text. But I would be happy to entertain questions on that particular issue, since the lead for providing cultural expertise on these negotiations came from here. Of course, also, the federal government does fund programs, either via its own programs or portfolio organization, to support culture internationally. Telefilm, very active, very present at Cannes Film Festival right now, of course. Canada Music Fund, Canada Council for the Arts, etc., etc. What we haven't done so well, I have to say, over the last years, some of you may remember that we had two programs delivered at the federal level that specifically targeted the promotion of Canadian culture abroad. These two programs were Trade Route and ProMart. Trade Route was a program that gave funding to small, medium enterprises to be able to become more export ready. And so this program was terminated in 2009. And ProMart was another program delivered by Foreign Affairs that supported international touring and more broadly cultural diplomatic initiatives. And so these two programs, I'm sure you remember, were abolished in 2009, 2010, and there was a lot of criticism because nothing was replacing these two programs. Over the last years as well, under the previous government, we have seen some diminished capacity in the missions abroad. Our embassies used to have systematically some positions for cultural attachés who played a big role in helping Canadian creators when they went abroad, just to make contacts, establish networks that would eventually lead to contracts. And these positions, for the most part, have been cut as part of budgetary reductions over the last few years. there has been as well, over the past few years, a focus essentially placed on minimal engagement and cultural diplomacy, and little to no emphasis on cultural exports. And I think this speaks to another point that Charles raised, is the fact that there needs to be more thinking about culture as an economic driver, and the most recent numbers are actually confirming the importance of the cultural sector with respect to its contribution to Canadian prosperity. I think it's yesterday that Statistics Canada released some new numbers, and in 2010, the contribution of culture to the GDP was around $47.4 billion. That's in 2010. And the latest numbers that were released yesterday, that are 2014, are $54.6 billion of direct contribution from the cultural sector to prosperity. And so there certainly is now beginning to be a recognition that, like agriculture, like forestry, like mining, the cultural sector is key. And so, of course, this brings us to think more about exports as we did before. I mean, as you know, as of last year, cultural industries, for instance, was not recognized as a trade priority sector by the Department of Foreign Affairs. And often when we thought about culture, it was to sell other products. So, for instance, if you were to organize an event in Azerbaijan to sell Bombardier jets, well, you would bring a theater troupe to showcase the planes. The theater troupe was not in itself considered to be a commodity that needed more visibility and more production, more promotion. And so the big change happened, of course, with the new government, but also it's a change that's been coming through the arrival of the big D word, which is digital. And so, you know, in this particular slide, and again, I won't go into too much detail, but it kind of explains the big shifts that we've seen with the arrival of digital. So moving from a linear environment, or what we call here a push technology, to more of a fluid environment where the consumer is actually in a position where they can pick and choose what they want to consume in terms of culture, products, or services. What's also interesting is we used to have clear distinctions between a creator and a consumer. Things are blurred now. A creator is also a consumer, and a consumer can be a creator. So the traditional players have changed also considerably. Of course, we can think about the emergence of new players like Google, Facebook, YouTube, Amazon. This is changing completely the landscape. But what I want to focus on is the fact that previously our focus as a government was largely domestic. The focus was about making sure that we had a growing and strong Canadian market, a strong offer of Canadian cultural products, and we did that largely through regulation. Of course, the Canadian Content Quota, CanCon, for radio, television, broadcasters is the example that I think of, but it was mostly an inward-looking mindset. And now, because of the shift to digital, things have changed considerably, and to be able to survive domestically in an interconnected and global world, you have to go beyond your national borders. You need to succeed internationally if you are to survive. So the notion of cultural exports, or the ability to go and present and promote your cultural products abroad, is no longer a luxury. It's a necessity, if only to be able to survive domestically. So that's why the little square is in yellow, so I can focus the rest of my presentation on this idea of are we well equipped to go big, to go abroad in terms of promotion of our cultural products and cultural diversity on the global stage. So what does it mean, an increasingly interconnected global world? It means different things. For businesses, and this is a very recent report that came out of the McKinsey report, I think we need to realize that 50% of the world's traded services, and typically culture in international trade lingo is described as a service. So 50% of the world's traded services are already digitized, and the share is growing. So the big D shift is not slowing down. It's actually speeding up. about 12% of the global trade in goods is conducted via international e-commerce. What has become key now, because of course Canada is not the only one affected, everybody's affected by that. So now the key is to get to market. So speed to get to market is even a bigger priority in a digital world, which again begs the question, are we equipped to have that speed? Do we have, as a country, the right running shoes to be able to access these markets very, very quickly and make sure that, again, our offer is there in the market that will help us achieve the sustainability of our creators in Canada? So that's what I think, grosso modo, what it means for businesses. What does it mean for creators? So, well, a few things. First of all, we gotta remind ourselves that now that Canadians have access to content around the world, they expect that content to come from around the world. So they expect unrestricted access to movies, books, TV shows, wherever, whenever, on all platforms. And that's something that's new that we will have to deal with as we think about the tools that needs to be tweaked or put in place to support our creators domestically. The other idea, again, and I've raised this before, is that international audiences are critical to the sustainability of the cultural sector. Again, we used to focus on either our domestic market or selected markets, mostly the U.S. for English-speaking Canada, mostly France for French-speaking markets. But now it's no longer sufficient. We got to go big, we got to go broad, and we got to have a better understanding of actually what's going to resonate in these markets that are, for some of us, completely foreign. It's different consumer habits of culture. Relation to culture is a little different. But we need to keep that in mind. What does it mean for governments? Tying it back to the actual theme of this conference. Just as business models have to evolve, governance models also need to adapt. I spoke about, do we have the right running shoes to be able to go very quickly to these new markets? Do we have a model here, Canada, that is conducive to Canadian content, of course, being created, because you can't promote anything if you don't have anything to promote, but also discovered. The discoverability of Canadian content on foreign markets and global markets is something that is completely new. It's a new concept that we need to bring our attention to. Do we have the right toolbox as well? Do we have the right focus? Do we have the capacity and the knowledge? I think unlike some other countries who have realize the need to go global, like the UK and Japan and to some extent New Zealand, we need to start from scratch, because some of the capacity that we originally had has been considerably diminished over the last years. And maybe to tie it back to the UNESCO Convention, how do we find the right balance between protecting and promoting our cultural diversity? And maybe two questions that you may want to reflect on during the course of this conference is, are these two concepts antonymous or complementary? Can you promote and protect at the same time? Should we just focus on promoting and forget about protecting? And how do we build on the UNESCO 2005 Convention to be able to achieve these objectives? And so, moving forward, maybe just to close up on this presentation, that I really wanted to be as short as possible so we can have a conversation, is to tell you a little bit about what we're doing to address these issues around, making sure that we have a governance model, that we have the tools that are conducive to promoting Canadian cultural exports. Well, first of all, we needed to acknowledge the issue, and we were very happy as public servants to see that the new incoming government from the get-go acknowledged the importance of promoting Canadian culture abroad. So as you can see in the most recent commitment and in the publicly released mandate letters of three ministers, Minister Joly, my minister, Minister Dion, Foreign Affairs, and Minister Freeland, Minister of International Trade, there is a commitment to restore our capacity to be able to do international cultural promotion, strengthen and foster cultural exports, and that has been recognized. At the same time, I think, and I've alluded to this earlier, we need to recognize our strengths. There is an appetite for Canadian content, in English language that is not from the U.S., Canadian in French language that is not from France. There is an appetite, and Canada is actually well positioned to be able to promote its exports. But we also need to recognize our own weaknesses, and some of them are linked to understanding the business of trade. And for that, I think cultural industries and the art sector in particular need to sit down for a moment and think about their activities as a business, because trade is a business. And so this brings me to the second point, which is re-engaging with experts and practitioners. And I think, Charles, you said a lot of things in your presentation. I keep referring to your presentation. So something else that Charles said is the need to talk to civil society, to sit down, public servants, politicians, and civil society to figure it out, because this is not something that government will be able to do by itself. And again, the new government is very keen in consulting, and so Minister Joly recently announced pre-consultations on strengthening Canadian content creation, discoverability, and export in a digital world. The hope is that these pre-consultations, which just for your information, seek to ensure that we're asking the right questions, they will lead to probably full-fledged public consultations later in the year. So the will to re-engage with experts and practitioners is there. The will also at the officials level is there. I've been tasked personally with delivering on the commitment in the budget 2016 around showcasing the arts and cultural industries on the global scene. And so we've been asked to develop a cultural export strategy, and we will be taking our time to get things right, which means we will be hosting technical conversations with practitioners, with experts, to figure out exactly what's missing, what are the gaps, what should we be doing, how we should set up the governance model that is conducive to promoting Canadian culture abroad. And of course, this conference is another way of re-engaging with experts and practitioners. Another thing that the new government is very strong on, and of course it resonates with public servants because we've been advocating it for years, is the importance of strong evidence. I gave you some of the numbers coming from StatsCan. We hope there's going to be more. But one of the big challenges we have with cultural exports is actually getting the numbers. The numbers that we have are partial. Some industries do track their exports. Some don't. I mean, in the area of music streaming, for example, it's very hard to define what is an export. Is it something that is bought via iTunes in Hong Kong? Is that how do you pull together all that evidence? How do you gather intelligence on key markets as well? So again, we've been out of this business for a while for reasons that I've mentioned before. We need to get back into the business, and so it starts with figuring out exactly what's out there and what the hard facts are. CRTC is doing the same thing with its Discoverability Summit, and actually the CRTC is going very bold and trying to tackle the big issues around Canadian content quotas, for instance, and of course involve provinces and territories. Culture is something, is a split responsibility in between the federal, the provincial, and territorial governments, and provinces are doing a lot of things. I know out in BC in particular, BC Creative is in the process of launching their own cultural export strategy. I mean, we can learn from that. We need to get together to create not only a momentum, but to create a bigger buzz. And I think that certainly is something that we're hearing a lot from stakeholders, is the importance for Canada to go big, but to go big in a coordinated way so that we don't step on each other's toes, and we create a buzz around our quality Canadian content. And finally, ask the right questions. I mean, that's fundamental to getting the right diagnostic that will hopefully lead us to good recommendations to our political masters, is asking the right questions. So what are we exporting? Are we well supported? Are our creators well supported? Do they know how to export? I said earlier that some of them need to start considering that as a business in itself. Are there means and resources out there to help them navigate those treacherous waters of going into foreign markets? Should there be new policies and programs installed? Should we restore trade routes or and ProMart? Or are these programs completely passé and we need new things? What exactly do we know? So these are the type of questions that we're asking as the federal government and as the Department of Canadian Heritage right now, which is very exciting, I have to admit. We're very happy to be in that position. I mean, for years, most of our efforts were put into protecting what we've got. Now I think we're moving into another paradigm, which is growing what we've got, making sure that it gets discovered, not only created, but it gets discovered, because when it gets discovered, it actually brings back revenues to our creators and make sure that it ensures that the cultural sector is sustainable, vibrant, and that creators are making a good living out of their art and their creation. But also, I think it contributes directly to some of the objectives of the UNESCO Convention, which, as I said earlier, is, yes, about protecting cultural diversity, but I think it's also about enhancing it, promoting it, and by having more Canadian content around the world, you're actually setting the stage for a more diversified cultural offer. So that's, I think, all I wanted to say today, and I would be happy to have your questions and to continue the dialogue with all of you. Merci.
Thank you so much, Natalie. You've mapped out the territory extremely well. You've raised some challenges, some questions, the ongoing challenge of definition, of evidence. But I will turn the over to the audience for your comments and questions. Well, maybe I will ask a question. In terms of the promotion and your focus on the international scene, I'm wondering, in terms of promotion domestically for support in public education, do you find, is that something that's a challenge for us going forward, to have the public support the kind of policies and directions that you've outlined?
That's a good question. I'm not sure how to answer it. In terms of public education, are you talking about the education system itself, or you're just public support for what we're trying to do?
More general, the public support, yes. Engaging people in understanding where we're going, why we're going there, why culture matters in all our lives.
Well, that's a very good question, and I think the consultations that Minister Joly is going to hold are going to be quite revealing. Of course, the groups and the citizens that are more likely to actually participate in those consultations are probably the ones that already support culture. And so it's a hard question to answer. I mean, I think there's probably a general recognition that culture is important, but I think we need to make a better job in refining that, in that making the case that culture is not important only for culture's sake. It's important because it creates jobs. And I think that's an interesting hook. It's an interesting storyline and narrative that we need to develop further. And by having more evidence of that culture creates job. When you support your creators, you actually make your cities more interesting for foreign investors, for example. The Ubisoft, who's the huge French multinational in video games, there's a reason why they chose, well, there's a couple of reasons, but there's that they chose Montreal to set up. The first reason is tax credit, which is not something that you need to disqualify, but also because Ubisoft, in its managerial philosophy, wants to set up in cities where there's a quality of life. And quality of life comes with a cultural offering. And so, so the direct link between investing in culture means investing in your economy. I think it's something that is likely to resonate, but we need to make we need to tell a better story. And I would admit that it's top of mind of certainly Madame Joly. When Madame Joly first met us, she very candidly admitted that she was looking at this from an economic angle because she probably feels that this is the best way to make sure that we can invest in culture if we bring it back to this idea that investing in culture means investing in the economy. And I don't think it's pushing away or negating, if that's a word in English, the social aspect of culture. I think that's a given, but we need to make a better job in telling the other side of the story.
Thank you. We have another question from the floor here.
Marie Batiste here. I'm at the University of Saskatchewan. I appreciate that we need to think about, the ways in which we can promote culture. However, one of the things that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has raised is how important it is for Canada and other places, I would say, to examine the historical consequences of a culture that has wiped away and is eroding away Indigenous cultures across Canada. And that a lot of people are able to use some of their culture in exports and other kinds of promotion of dress and song and other things. But it is more important for us, not so much for the job, but for the collective well-being it serves for us to restore and renew and regenerate our Indigenous cultures for the kinds of things that is going to build on the teachings and the Indigenous knowledges that we carry. So that's a really important thing for me in terms of not just looking at the job angle, but I think we need to look at the historical and moral and cultural imperatives that are within our communities. But secondly is an important one about the ethics, that a lot of our cultural heritage is being appropriated, putting on the runways across, with headdresses and, highly sexualized, Indian dresses and kinds of things, movies, Pocahontas and whatever all. And I think that there's a collective issue ethic that needs to be addressed. And I think that, it is a protection issue. And Saigej and I have talked about that in our Protecting Indigenous Knowledge and Heritage. So I think it's a really sort of a dual kind of thing. Like we recognize its importance for one end, but there has to be another educative kind of element to the work that you do in terms of promotion. And I would very much like to have you speak to not just jobs in your narrative, but to the importance and the variations and distinctiveness of Indigenous cultures in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I completely agree. I deliberately chose to focus the presentation on cultural exports, but I completely recognize that this is a much broader discussion to have on the misappropriation of traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expression. Thank you for your question, because this is a file that I follow with my other hat, which is the Copyright Act, and you may know that there's a lot of negotiations going on internationally in the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity, but also under the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, on how to protect TK, traditional knowledge, and TCE's, traditional cultural expression, from misappropriation. And so these conversations have been going on for a long time. And there are multiple departments here at the federal level who are involved in supporting those negotiations. And we've had some conversations to prepare for these negotiations with the AFN, with the Métis Council, Kathy Hodgson-Smith out of Saskatchewan, actually, and the Inuit Circumpolar as well. It's a tricky one, and it's one that is worthy of an entire conference in itself. I completely agree, and I take your point that, again, it's about finding the right balance between promotion and protecting. But to promote something, to protect something, you need to promote it, and to promote it, you need to protect it. And so it's finding the right balance. But on TK and TCEs and the misappropriation, yes, the only thing I can say is I can agree with you. I think there should be more opportunities in Canada to have conversations on these specific subjects, on the tools that we have within our federal toolbox that could be better leveraged to address some of these issues around, for instance, the moral rights of Indigenous peoples around their TK and TCEs. I know we've got some experts across the country, but and that's just a personal opinion. I would really, truly welcome a dedicated conference just on that. There's some interesting best practices coming out of New Zealand and Australia that we could be looking at to make it easier for Indigenous people to protect their TK and their TCEs. And I think that you're right, the TRC and the changing position of this government around the UN DRIP actually lends themselves very well to having these conversations around the protection of Indigenous cultures.
Thank you. I recognize one, if we could keep it short, Mary.
I'll try. Mary Blackstone with the Saskatchewan Partnership for Arts Research. I welcome the initiative to focus on global exports and to think consciously about Canadian culture can be moved beyond our borders. It certainly in the context of the low income that our artists experience here and elsewhere in Canada, that's a promising initiative. It seems to me, though, that to follow a bit along with the previous question, that we need to be talking about exporting Canadian cultures, plural. We've moved beyond the days of the Massey Commission where we were creating Canadian culture. And I think that part of what I hope we're doing today is talking about cultures. And that presents some challenges internally and externally. The concept of export is a positive one, but it sends us out into exploring words such as assimilation and the cultural appropriation that was mentioned earlier. But it's also a case of survival of the fittest. And when we start having cultures rubbing up against each other, whether they're in Canada or whether they're externally, rubbing up against each other, we have to recognize this applies to language as well as our artist creations. We have to recognize that what we're going to end up with is potentially a giving way on the part of some cultures and the creation of new culture. And how do we negotiate that reality in the context of the exports that you're talking about and, of course, internally in Canada?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, you know, as soon as you get out of your borders, you do rub against other cultures, and you know, one aspect is possible assimilation. The other one is cross-pollination. You know, at the end of the day, I think we've got no choice. Digital has made it so that we cannot survive in our various cultures, and I completely take your point. The various expressions of culture in Canada, just to be able to continue to grow and to grow, need absolutely to get out of Canada. It's just the reality of what digital has brought. I mean, it's so easy now for everyone to get access to cultures from the other side of the world, and that's not negative. But it's also way easier for somebody in his or her basement in Timmins, Ontario, to send his or her expression of his or her culture out to a foreign market as well. So the easiness is a good thing, but it comes with challenges, and I think we need to be careful. The question is, where, as a government, do you put your focus? Culture creates itself as well. You know, you will always have creators. I think the responsibility is to make sure that creators can create in the best conditions, and for that you need the right toolbox, you need the right legislative and regulatory framework, which includes the Copyright Act, to make sure that creators get paid for what they create. But you also need to give the tools to the creators so they can work on their own survival and sustainability. And so, you know, I'm speaking from the point of view of a public servant who's responsible for developing programs and policies. And so these are the questions. What should we do to help? What should we do to make sure that these creators in their basement and Timmins can continue to create? And for them to be able to create, they need to be able to make a living out of it. And now with digital, making a living out of culture means going global. There's no way around it. You know, just focusing on your domestic market is just not sufficient anymore. And so what do we do here to make that happen while keeping the necessary safeguards that you've probably alluded to?
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. We've gone a bit over, but that's because you were challenging and interesting and engaging. And I do want to thank you. All of us want to thank you for joining us this morning. And I can assure you your questions and comments will remain alive in our conversations the rest of the day. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Have a great conference.